Good morning. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Olha, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Ukraine Media Center today. Yesterday, the president of Ukraine has announced yet another Crimean platform summit to be held on the 11th of September. And today, within the framework of preparation to the summit, we have invited all of you to this event, during which we will talk about the eradication of freedom of speech in Crimea. And also today we are about to discuss the book by Ukrainian journalist Yuriy Lukanov called The Press: How Russia Destroyed Media Freedom in Crimea. The book was out from a German publishing house. It was also sold in English language. There was a presentation in a number of cities of Europe. So let me introduce our speakers. Joining us today are Yuriy Lukanov, freelance journalist, also author of The Press: How Russia Destroyed Media Freedom in Crimea. Also joining us is Valentyna Samar, editor-in-chief of the Center for Investigative Journalism, and Olha Skrypnyk, chair of the board of the Crimean Human Rights Group, coordinator of the Crimean Platform Expert Network. Good morning, dear friends. So, Mr. Yuriy, the floor is yours. Let's talk about the book, about the key things documented there. And let's talk in general about the perception of the book by the foreign audience. For what we understand, there was a number of presentations held in a number of countries. So what are the results so far? The microphone, please. Good morning. Thank you for coming, dear colleagues. My special appreciation to you, because Crimea is an Achilles heel for Putin, but still this topic is covered way less than it deserves to be covered. That's why it's real good that you've come. I hope that using your support we may promote this book even better. It's The Press: How Russia Destroyed Media Freedom in Crimea. Are there any English speakers? Well, we have simultaneous translation in place here. So, How Russia Destroyed Media Freedom in Crimea is the second edition of the book. The first was out in Ukrainian and English language back in 2018 or 2017. Upon request of the Ibidem Verlag, the German publishing house, I've updated it with a number of sections, and the first presentation took place in Great Britain in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for universities and the Financial Times newspaper. Well, one of the presentations in one of the universities was a failure, but let's go straight forward to business. So let me click it right here. So I will cover the main statements covered in this book right just briefly. I think that you all may know, but let me remind you that Russia was using a number of activities to eradicate the freedom of speech in Crimea due to the reasons we all understand, in particular quite a gorgeous fact that confirms the fact that they were preparing to it way before, is that in December 2013 they've adopted an amendment to the Criminal Code of Russian Federation about increase of liability for calls of disintegration of Russian Federation. Even the human rights experts were calling that amendment the Crimea Amendment further on. So what were the activities that they were exercising? So under this amendment that I've mentioned, and by the way, in a number of months they've even intensified the liability. So under this amendment, Mykola Semenash, the veteran of Crimean journalism, was accused. Thankfully, he was of pension age. He had problems with health, and he was given only a conditional sentence. But under this amendment, he was sentenced to a conditional term. And also, Anna Andreyevska and Andrei Klimenko, against them there was a criminal case initiated. Fortunately, they were in the territory under Ukrainian control, mainland Ukraine. That's why Russians were unable to reach them. Well, I apologize, I may be mistaken. Then, I was there back then, at that moment. We even had a press conference with Valentyna Samar. She is the director, or she used to be a director of the Bureau of Journalist Investigations. And back then we found out that a French journalist, David Geffry, was captured. He was the filmmaker of Channel Plus, and we, with Sergei Krushin and another person who is currently staying in Russia, that's why I'm not going to call his name, so we went to Russia. We were faking it to be important persons. We were demonstrating the ideas of International Journalist Union, and we tried to pull him from his captivity back in Russia. But he was not the only one. Also, in this picture, you can see Yaroslav Pelinsky, who is a filmmaker. Together with his photographer, Yuriy Lukanov, he was captured too, and they spent about 7 days there in captivity. So, Yaroslav's wife found contacts in the Ministry of Defense of Russia, and they were able to pull him out. But the French journalist, you can see the raccoons in that picture, and the biggest one in the picture, he's Vladislav, I can't remember his name. So he's a person with a criminal background, and even before he was part of that unit that was capturing a French photographer, so he was a political officer back then. So there is a criminal case initiated against him now in Ukraine. I was witnessing against him in the court. I don't know about the sentence, but again, one of the methods was captivity. Then the proceedings with regard to Mykola Semeny, I'm clicking it backwards. On top of that, they were bold enough to promote Dunya Miyatovich, who was a UN representative, an OSCE commissioner for freedom of speech, and a special envoy of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Robert Seri. You can see them both on the pictures. Well, you can read more details. By the way, if you want, you may Google it. It is available online by Yuriy Lukanov. Press machine, how Russia destroyed media, the freedom of speech in Crimea. So Google it and you can read everything about those facts in that book. Also, there was beating of a group of journalists, not only the Ukrainian ones, also the foreign ones. They came to Sevastopol when they found out that there is a military base about to be captured, and there was a number of young people, the real goons with weapons, who were shooting in the skies. They broke all of the appliances, all of the gadgets of those journalists, and then those facts were promulgated that all those activities were coordinated by FSB. On top of that, there was a number of other beatings in Crimea. Then they tried to push out all of the national Ukrainian channels out of the air, and they were replaced with Russian TV channels. And respectively, there was a pressure exercised on Crimean theater channel ATR that was of high quality, because sometimes, so the channels of the national minorities, they sometimes of not so good quality, but that one was real good. They were trying to play with Crimean theaters, and they allowed the TV channel to work, but then it was shut down too. After that, in fact, they've eradicated all of the field of professional journalism, but such a phenomena emerged that is called the civil journalism. People who had nothing to do with the journalism, they just come and they started handing over the information, and against them the repression started. And on this picture you can see Yaroslav Yosipenko, who is working for Crimea Realities. He was coming there. He's not Crimean, but he was coming there, and he got sentenced to a long term. I don't remember. He was accused of storage of firearms or drugs. Firearms, right? And then what was her name again? Irina Danilovich. Irina Danilovich was never even writing about politics. She was writing about medical problems. She has become a blogger, but it turned out she could not write about those problems too. She was kidnapped. The family members were not able to find out where she was. And again, she was accused of storing of drugs or firearms. Yeah, firearms again. So she was sentenced to a long term. She ended up in a terrible situation. She got problems with her health, and she was deported to Russia, which is not allowed under Geneva Conventions, because you cannot deport people from captured territories. You cannot deport citizens of those territories. You cannot deport them to the occupiers' countries. So she's having problems with her health, and she is not provided any medical aid. So her father is desperate, and what's even more terrible, during her search in her house, the first edition of my book was found at her flat, and she basically, what's so tragic is that she experienced it on herself, something that she read before it in the book. So that book served as an evidence during the court proceedings initiated against her. And a cherry on top, like, I'm a journalist. I was writing a lot of documentary books. I have a lot of journalist reports, co-eds, and so on and so forth. And based on my experience, I have written this book, Reporter Volkovsky, the prose book. It was issued in Ukrainian and translated into English language. I was presenting it in the United States back in April last year. So this is what I wanted to boast a little bit. I hope I'm not out of time. Thank you for your attention. Let me give the floor to my colleagues, and if there are any questions to me or my colleagues, please let us know, and we're open to any and all of your questions. Thank you, Mr. Yuriy. Mr. Valentyna, I would like to ask you, so what are the methods that Russians use to suppress both the freedom of speech and in violation of human rights in the Crimean Peninsula? It's no secret to anybody that those methods were changing, and human rights organizations and our law enforcement usually say that they transformed if we compare, say, year 2014 to year 2024. So what do you document now? Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Mr. Yuriy, because he was the one who made us tell all those stories. I mean, the Crimean journalists who were experiencing the oppression and the total ban of their profession back in 2014, 2015, and I need to say that we are the thankful readers of your book issued in Ukrainian. There are pro-Ukrainian Crimean law enforcement officers. You know, all those stories that you've told, they are laid as foundation of criminal proceedings. For example, there are already rulings made by the courts on the case of Anna Andreevska, for example, the first criminal case initiated by FSB under this Article 280 remark, the Crimean Amendment, that calls in press or internet for disintegration or violation of territorial integrity of Russian Federation. And the FSB officers who were fabricating that case were convicted to 12 years sentence in Ukraine in absentia, but we hope that those traitors, those traitors, the former officers of State Security Service of Ukraine, will be convicted for real terms as soon as Crimea is liberated. So the methods that you've mentioned, they are mutating with the transformation of the new technologies, because the policies exercised by Russia in Crimea are part of military strategy that Russia promotes as they capture territories. If we remember the doctrine of Gerasimov, basically he provides all of the notions there. So what does the doctrine mean? Non-military methods thanks to which one may achieve the results. So using policies, information, and sometimes it's some specialized information operations, because something may exist in media but not exist in reality, but it still does its thing as misinformation, propaganda, and creation of such media persons who have no meaning of themselves, but they start becoming talking heads, announcing the things that the military command needs to announce. So the methods are pretty common. First, clearance of territory of representatives of civil sector, everybody who does not agree with the general line. So someone whose opinion may be important as an expert opinion. Also clearance of media business, expropriation of technical equipment. Our equipment was arrested and our publishing house was forced to evacuate to Kiev back in 2014, just like Black Sea Media Company, ATR, about 10 different publishing houses and media outlets started working in the free territory, rebirthing the Crimean journalism. And another method is filtration of information. Yuriy was a witness of the way the people from special services were working, organizing the foreign journalists back in 2014. Everybody was banned the access to the Supreme Council of Crimea. Everybody was banned from access to the sources of information. But again, there was a number of foreign journalists brought to Crimea, Simon Schuster among them, and they were getting the information in doses. They were provided the narratives necessary for occupational administration and special services. Basically, they built the military vertical, and they were the key players there. Those who were providing the information for the general public. And the task of the journalists was risking their life and health, their freedom to seek that information, and those severe beatings that Yuriy mentioned, including the group with Andrei Tsaplienko, Kostas Anisenko, Alena Mechanik. Basically, such groups of journalists that were staying near the blockaded military units, they were the first to be attacked by the so-called self-defense of Crimea or the self-defense of Sevastopol, who were guided by the military, and basically they were beating, robbing those journalists, pushing them out of Crimea to pass their referendum under loyal cameras. So when I'm being asked what's the situation with the freedom of speech in Crimea, the answer is simple. It does not exist in Crimea. It cannot exist in Crimea because the things that could be said, say, in Moscow or St. Petersburg, they cannot be said in Crimea because previously, until the year 2022, there were some manifestations with Ukrainian flags. Well, they are now suppressed, but they existed before 2022, but they did not exist before that in Crimea, and such persons as journalist Osipenko are still being held captive. And there's a lot of people who wait for the Crimea to be liberated, and them, just like us back in 2014, risking their life and health, they pass the information to us. You see, there's a lot of information flow from Crimea. The shootings of the incoming projectiles, the military installations, a lot of information that people pass to the mainland Ukraine, including to the intelligence bodies. So risking their life and health, people pass that information to us, so we understand what's really going on in Crimea. Also, we observe such a situation that in the South Russia was not able to achieve that effect that they were waited for. Like in Kherson and Zaporizhia region, there was no single publishing house, no single media outlet who would cooperate with the occupiers. As a result, they had to bring the team by Alexander Malkevich, a well-known propagandist who brought people from St. Petersburg who were teaching school children, who were teaching journalism to school children. And they were trying to establish publishing houses in Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, but in none of those regions, no single media outlet agreed to collaborate with Russians. So please stop me if I'm taking too much time. Well, it's an interesting question. Yuriy touched upon the topic of civil journalism that emerged. It was visible in Crimea. So to what extent it's safe to say that the civil journalism still exists in Crimea? Well, it does exist. There are people who manage to hand over some information, even training. There is such a Crimean teacher, Mumine Saliyeva. Her husband was sentenced to 12 or 15 years, some crazy term actually. And after that, she has become the one who started telling about what's going on in Crimea in such a flexible manner, I would say, because they organize education for the children of the repressed tatars, and she is studying to become a journalist in one of the educational institutions, and she organizes the exhibitions about the situation with Crimean kids abroad and in mainland Ukraine. She had some warnings, but so far she's managing to avoid any threats. There are other journalists. She's a protagonist of my book, but I don't want to call the names of the others because it will pose a risk to them. And let me make yet another statement. Valentyna mentioned that they were inviting journalists, and there's yet another interesting nuance. So we've come up with the list of those journalists who were formally invited by Russia today. Well, but de facto we understand that it's Russian government who invited them. So they invited them at their cost. There were journalists from India, from United States Public Radio, extremely popular. There were correspondents from that public radio too, and those publications that are found in English language. So they were describing the situation under the Russian angle, and if they mentioned Ukraine, it was just 2 lines, or they were completely omitting, like they were saying something happened and Ukraine does not agree with that. And I found those media outlets, and I've written letters to them that this is what's happening. This is happening at Russians' money, and please take into account Ukrainian position here. So no one responded to me. So again, they were describing the situation under that angle that I've told you about. Well, thank you. One of the important challenges for all of us at the level of civil society and the state is the topic of Crimea in international agenda. And definitely the Crimean Platform Summit, one of its goals is again to draw the attention of international community to the topic of Crimea. So to what extent, Olga, are we making it? To what extent are we able to describe all of the problems like occupation, violation of human rights? How can we communicate? To what extent are we communicating it to the foreign public? Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I would like to thank my colleagues, Yuriy and Valentyna. the fact that you're visiting means that you're real curious about what's going on in Crimea, about the violations of human rights in Crimea and what Russians do in relation of our journalists. So what I want to mention is that currently there are at least 15 journalists behind the bars due to their activity. Among them are professional journalists such as Vladislav Yesepenko, Radio Freedom journalist. Yesterday we were celebrating 70 years of Ukrainian branch of Radio Freedom. Also Alexei Bessarabov, who was working for Ukrainian media and now under espionage, he's been sentenced to illegal term. But the majority of those 15 are the civil journalists who reacted to the oppressions, and they started covering all those violations of human rights. Among them, there is a number of Crimean terror activists like Ruslan Suleimanov, Hasan Akhtemov, and then Ernest Semetov, Valentyna, and a number of others. Some of them require immediate medical aid, including Irina Danilevich, who has serious hearing impairments due to failure to provide medical aid, and now she experienced yet another tragedy, the death of her father, who was not able to wait for her from captivity. So it all destroys the lives of our prisoners whose lives are ruined there. Also, Nariman Jalal was part of this list, but fortunately we have good news about him being brought back. That's the first case after the year 2022 when not only Crimean theater activist but also a person from Crimea who was brought back. He was the first Crimean to be brought back under the year 22. As a result of all of the negotiations before 2022, there were only 8 Crimeans, people sentenced under that Crimean amendment, who were brought back to Ukraine under different political agreements. And given the total number of 200 people, within 10 years we have only 9 people who were brought back. Those are horrible figures. It means that Russia doesn't give our people back, and after year 2022 we still don't have mechanisms in place to bring back civil hostages, in particular Crimean Tatars, because Russia does not agree to any concessions, to any negotiations. And again, it's part of the job that we're supposed to do on the international level. Crimean platform used to be a key tool for the international community, is the only formal forum, the only international platform created in 2022 for the occupation and reintegration of Crimea. Basically, more than 60 countries support the Crimean platform starting from year 2021. It's not only words, those are the memoranda that they signed that clearly stipulate that those countries have united to deoccupy Crimea. I think that it's a public recognition of their stance, which is a key element for us. For the time being, Crimean platform is way more expanded because it's clear we deal with the challenges related to the war, and Crimean platform usually turns out to be a tool that draws the attention of international media. So basically tomorrow will be the 4th summit, the government summit of Crimean platform, and another activity will be held in October, a parliamentary summit that will take place in Latvia. Again, that's another important platform for us to draw the international attention, because the event is going to be held in a European country. And another element is Black Sea Security Conference that takes place in different countries. But honestly, if we look at what's going on, we have to be open and not end up in a trap of something that seems to be obvious for us. None of those things mean that they are perceived in the same way abroad. And I would like to thank our long-term partners, the Ukraine Media Center, who were studying the media of Canada, United States, and Great Britain, the top media, about the way Crimea is represented, and it's definitely not something that we would like to expect and see. The main thing that we have to understand, like we were studying the last year, studying from the May 23 to May 24. So if Crimea was covered, it was covered in the context of battle operations, counteroffensive operations, attacks on Crimea, or Russian attacks from Crimea on our infrastructure in Ukraine. So basically the topics that we want to cover in all of the platforms, such as political prisoners, Crimean debtors, operations of freedom of speech, they are not represented in the media outlets of our partners, such as Great Britain, United States, and Canada, and those activities exercised by Mr. Yuriy Lukanov in the presentation of his book abroad, they are very important. If we're not there, the Russians are there, and they are there. They know my activities abroad show that they have become even more active within the last year, and the monitoring done by our media center colleagues say that Crimea was mentioned is in a positive key, that Crimea is Ukraine, Ukraine is going to bring Crimea back, the military operations. There was a lot of mentions in the summer, but then there was October. We remember about all those horrible events in Israel, and that was one of the big waves of Russian propaganda, for example, in the United States, that influenced significantly on the fact that Crimea was put in the background. It was poorly covered or not covered at all, and yet another explosions of Russian propaganda. Remember when a big package of military aid was reviewed, it was a peak for Russian propaganda. They were working in all of the levels, and unfortunately they proved to be effective. Because back then, when the Congress was considering the Ukrainian aid, pro-Russian narratives outweighed all of the Ukrainian ones. And we have to recognize it. And I think it would be interesting to hear for everybody. If we talk about English-speaking media, it was Great Britain, Canada, and United States that were surveyed. The Crimea was mentioned in the context of battle operations or geopolitical. And talking about the violation of human rights, only 3% of the articles account for it. So what Yuriy has described about the violation of journalists' rights and the oppression, it takes only 3% of all of the mentions in the media outlets of our partners. Political prisoners that we fight for, only 1%. The persecution of Crimean tatars, even less than 1%. However, we know that all of those countries support the Crimean tatars, they support their families, they provide all kinds of aid, but it's less than 1% of coverage in the media, so it's difficult to talk about more than 20,000 civil hostages with the Americans. How can we communicate this topic if only 1% of the media outlets said that the political prisoners exist? And yet another study, that was one of the studies that we've done with the Media Center about Great Britain, US, and Canada media outlets. And in another study, we were trying to analyze a number of European countries. We were analyzing the media in the languages of their countries. So we were curious, what do the local readers read in their language? So we studied a number of countries: Romania, Poland, Netherlands, Hungary, Switzerland, Sweden, and Germany. So we're trying to study the topic of Crimea. Crimea was well represented. I mean, it was mentioned quite frequently, mostly in the context of battle operations, but we have to understand that there's a lot of pro-Russian narratives about Crimea, about its future and history. And I think that would be the most obvious, the most neutral context of the mentions of Crimea were in Switzerland, without any political coloration, so to say. But talking about pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian representation, pro-Ukrainian representation was in the media of Poland, Sweden, and Romania. And talking about pro-Russian mentions, they prevail in Italy, France, and the Netherlands. However, we are aware of in intense military support coming from those countries. So it's not about the government position. Again, it's only the way that Crimea is mentioned in the media of those countries. And again, not to take a lot of time, let me give you the example of persecution of Crimean Tatars, persecution of Crimean Tatar people in those European media. Again, the mentionings of Crimean Tatars is only 3% of coverage, 3% of the total number of times that Crimea was mentioned. And again, they are covered in a number of aspects. Not all of the topics are represented. Very little attention is paid to the topic of human rights violation. What's mostly mentioned in European media is cultural heritage of Crimean Tatars, and generally when Russian occupation of Crimea is described, Crimean Tatars topic is mentioned, and there was a number of publications related to appointment of Rustem Umerov as a Minister of Defense of Ukraine. Again, it influenced the fact that the persecution of Crimean Tatars was mentioned in European media. And let me get a couple of words about Middle Eastern part of this study. We were analyzing the countries who touch upon the topic of Crimea, obviously those writing in Arabic language, and back there the Crimean Tatars topic was mentioned somewhat more frequently, as well as Crimea, but mostly with pro-Russian position. Russian propaganda is very active there in Arabic language, and we cannot even influence anything there. The majority of the media mention Crimea in the context of Russian narratives, which is a negative phenomenon for us, which means that the world thinks about Crimea in the context of Russian propaganda, and that's the problem that we pay very little attention to. By us, I mean expert community and the state, because basically those topics are not represented there, let alone the topic of political prisoners. If Crimea is ever mentioned, it's mentioned in the context of combat operations and in the context of pro-Russian position in relation to Crimea, and I think that we have to understand this challenge, and within the framework of Crimean platform, we need to find out how to work with that part of the world, because they're pretty influential. We understand they influence the geopolitical, military issues, and pro-Ukrainian position as to Crimea is completely non-existent there. So I'm not going to take any more of your time. All of those materials are available in the website of Crimean Platform and Media Center, so please let us know, and we will be happy to share all those materials with you. Let me give you just a couple of words to finalize it. As it was said in one of the Soviet movies, the best thing you remember are the last things. So again, this book is commercial, it's available in Amazon. I hope that at least some of you may cover this event in English language, so if you mention it, so that book and Reporter Volkovsky, that's my military prose, there are English translations of them available in Amazon. Please pay attention to this fact. So, Mr. Yuriy, what was the printout? Well, I have no idea about the printout. There was only first and second edition for what I know, but now that you mention if there will be a second edition in Ukrainian, well, I would do this, but talking about, you know, I'm a person from Ruch. I was the head of PR service of Ruch, political force back then, and we were responding to some initiatives automatically. We were automatically supporting them. For the time being, all those presentations that I've organized, I organized them by myself. I had no single piece of support from the state, not from the consulates, not from the embassy in the United States. And talking about Britain, I never even contacted them. I've only contacted some civil organizations, but they've never responded. So I, as an adult, through my connections, through my contacts, save for the information for the Center for Human Rights that is currently called ZMINA, based upon initiative of which the first edition of this book was made. They were the only ones who've taken part in those events. and the rest of them I've organized by myself. So I think that I'm not crying it out to you. I'm just, it is the indicator of lack of solidarity in a society. I think that it's an indicator of the efficiency of the government. Let me pick up that ball that you've thrown. The figures that Olga has mentioned about the lack of support of such topics that are most sensitive for us, they are all explained by the fact that Ukrainian government poorly supports Crimean media. Just like media of Donetsk and Luhansk region, there were virtually no financial programs, budget programs to support those media outlets. Well, they were supporting us in production of some content, maybe issue of some books, but despite the existence of the Ministry of Reintegration that was established, no such programs were launched. And what Russia does, while clearing the area from the non-loyal activists, they've implemented huge grant programs coming from the federal budget, from the occupational budget, Crimean occupational budget, to support those TV companies. As they pushed ATR out of Crimea, what Russia has done, they've established the correct Crimean theater channel Nelet that is funded by the government. And they say, how come we violate the rights of indigenous population? We have the whole media company. And the same is happening with Ukrainian topic. They've made the fake civil organization Ukrainians of Crimea that is populated by collaborationists, and they were bringing them to OSCE meetings, different international platforms. Meanwhile, Ukraine was suing them in the United Nations court with regard of genocide of Crimean Tatars in Crimea and Ukrainians in Crimea. And they've established a number of long-term projects. For example, the Association of Friends of Crimea, when they were bringing different politicians, conservative, ultra-right, ultra-left, they were bringing the politicians from 30 countries to Crimea. They've established such clubs in 30 countries to legalize the illegal annexation of Crimea, to influence the governments of those countries, to ease the sanctions and to spread the narratives about how wonderful it is in Crimea. So those people were brought to different forums like Yalta International Economic Forum or the Forum of the Friends of Crimea. They were staying in the Maria Hotel in the Big Yalta. So this is where those forums were taking place. The people were getting money for participation in those forums, and then they were going to their countries and reproducing those narratives and the stories about Crimea, how wonderful it is to live there, how happy are the people there, and it's been lasting for more than a decade now. Are we aware of any similar program that formulates the narratives that are necessary for the state of Ukraine and for Crimeans? No, they do not exist. All of them are civil initiatives of the expert network of the Crimean platform that gathered the most experienced experts, not only in Crimean field, but also in human rights field, energy and legal field, legal sector, different sectors. And frequently the Ukrainian media invite the politologists that don't know anything about that topic, but they don't ask somebody who has been analyzing the information in all those sectors for a decade already, for more than a decade. So please address those who really study the topic of Crimea in all of its diversity. Dear colleagues, if you have any questions from the floor, please let us know. Yes, there is a question. Volodymyr Lyashenko, representative of the National Council in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. First of all, I support all of the words that were said. I was visiting Crimea back then. I've seen it in the happening. And let me throw a little bit to the fan as I talk about the popular Ukrainian media when they were building the picture for Ukrainian media. I remember back then I was watching those old Ukrainian media who were demonstrating the Russian picture, and how was it different from the local media in the territory of Crimea, like Chernomorka, ATR, who were demonstrating the situation that was really unfolding in Crimea, and not the situation that was copy-pasted from the Russian sources, so to say. So what I would like to ask, a lot was said today about what was happening, how Russia was clearing the field, but talking about the results, can you mention anything about the activity of the media center by Izmail Kaspinsky? That's a known media structure that was established by Russians in Crimea. That's a question in the context of the grand support of those so-called mass media that Russians have built in the territory that was cleared from real journalism. Thank you for your question. So who's ready to answer? So it was based in the library of Kasprinsky, yeah? Well, it's not the main platform that the Russians use, because what they've really created, they've created a big RIA Novosti media center, and this is where all of the key messages are flowing from. It's very well equipped in the trade unions house, where our media outlet was based before. And again, I was mentioning a number of forums that were held in Crimea on federal level that were attended by a large number of foreign journalists, foreign guests, and they used those platforms, those forums, at some big federal coin to, you don't have to persuade anybody in Crimea, so those local projects are not of interest to anybody. Only those were supported that were providing information about Crimea to the West, to first of all to legalize the annexation, and second to ease the Crimean sanctions that were imposed after the year 2014. And let me add a couple of words. Thank you, Volodymyr, for your question and for your work too. He's one of those who has been making his contribution for a number of years. He did not only come to Crimea, but he takes all possible efforts to make sure Crimea is being brought back to Ukraine. And again, Russia is using way more other tools. Our work is more related to criminal persecutions, and FSB, they have their projects, quite open ones and direct ones, so-called Smersh community that work in internet space, like the Russian blogger Talipov, who was cooperating with FSB starting from 2014, and this community is disclosing personal data. They call for prosecution of people with pro-Ukrainian position, and based on their reports, the criminal cases are initiated against pro-Ukrainian activists in Crimean territories. And one of the key elements of this thing is Telegram. I have no idea where else should I make this statement that Telegram is pure evil. It's FSB. All of the materials that are being sent through Telegram are included into the reports of FSB. They establish different communities in Telegram through which they lure Ukrainian people. They spread the information that they need, and based on Crimean experience, we see that it's one of the most influential tools that continues being popular. It's still popular in the territory under Ukrainian control. So using this opportunity, I would like to just give you another example of this tool to be an FSB tool, and the Smersh is a group of people who persecute others under those articles like calls for disintegration of Russian Federation. They persecute people directly in the street, they beat them, they follow them, and part of those things transform into criminal proceedings. Our people are being convicted under fabricated cases for high treason or espionage, and this practice is only spreading more and more. We see that starting from the 2022 to the year 2024, the scale has dramatically increased. Well, thank you very much. I would like to thank everybody who has joined us. I would like to thank our speakers who continue their fight despite all of the hardships. Olha, Skrypnyk, Valentyna, Samar, Yuriy Lukanov, thank you very much. And obviously I would like to thank our security and defense forces, thanks to whom we can hold events like this. Let's continue working together for our victory, and glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.